في أحد الأيام تعرضت منطقة الأنصاري لقصف بالبراميل المتفجرة. حصلنا نطالع العيلة الأولى والعيلة الثانية. العيلة الثالثة هي الأم والولد. هي فعلا يعني الأم كانت كثير منفعلة، عندها كثير كانت عصبية وكانت عم تصيح، يعني هي خايفة على حالها أو خايفة على ابنها. بعد الحفل الطويل حصلنا نسمع صوت الولد، صوت صار يبكي الولد، حصلنا نسمع صوته وكان كثير محل صعب. بعد ما وصلنا لولد هون صار الشغل كثير بده حذر، يعني هذا ولد عمره أسبوعين أو أكثر، بأي لحظة بيطب شي فوقه أو بيموت أو بيختنق. هلا 12 ساعة طبعا هي ما كلمة تنقال، يعني عمل كثير حذر، يعني هي روح بدك تتعامل معها بشكل خطير جدا. يعني إنه طفل عمره أسبوعين يطب فوقه برميل أو 3 سقوف ما يسيبوا شيء، يعني وكل هالضغوطات إنه هذا الطفل يطلع أقوى من البراميل وأقوى من السقوف وأقوى من كل شيء.
هذا إعجازه يا رب يا الله تبارك اسمك. أمه وينها؟ عدل أمك المال. الله شوي خالد عليه يا خالد. يا الله يا هو ثواني أبوسك ثواني عيسي.
زرتوا الولد بعد ما انقذتوه؟
ما عندنا وقت، قولي له قصف.
So Farouk, I mean, this is such an incredibly moving video. I've got an 11-month-old baby and can only imagine what people in Syria are going through. Can you tell us a little bit about the video and the work that you do and how that relates to the refugee crisis?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for everybody for giving us time to speak about our cause and the roots of the refugees problem in Syria. This video shows only just one example of one incident when the rescue workers had a camera to film what they did, and they were lucky to save the life of that baby. They saved the lives of more than 50,000 people till now in Syria, but regrettably more numbers were killed actually, and they couldn't find anyone to save them. This miracle baby, Mahmoud, and his mother, Meyvet Al-Bash, now an orphan in southern Turkey as refugees after the death of the father and other 3 children. And I knew that Meyvet, his mother, is looking for asylum in Europe now to come. And this is very obvious example of the roots of the refugees problem and why do people escape. The Syrian people are, of course, love their country and proud of their country, their life. They did not escape because of hunger, but they mainly escape of Syria because of the lack of security, because of the deliberate targeting of local communities in Syria, particularly those communities who become out of control of the Syrian government. Since latest 2012, the Syrian regime troops were obliged or chose to withdraw from some areas and impose a collective punishment on those communities that included using barrel bombs, which are totally indiscriminate, and in addition to the siege and torture for anyone who might fall in hands of the security forces. Then later on we had the extremism problem, which was a symptom actually, and as a result of the original roots of the problem in Syria. Now, millions of Syrians have fled the country, and there are millions who were displaced inside Syria. All of them dream of going back homes, and they would not be able to go back without a serious commitment from our friends in the world to put an end for that conflict which is going on in Syria. Aerial bombardment is responsible of more than 80% of the casualties in Syria. Most of the Syrian casualties were not killed by knives or traditional weapons. They were killed by barrel bombs and partially by unconventional weapons like the chemical weapons. And of course, the aerial bombardment plus later on the terrorist attacks and the very hard conditions for the people who are still suffering inside Syria because of the siege and because of the lack of essential services, as most of the infrastructure have collapsed and most of the medical facilities and the schools were deliberately targeted. Just today, Dr. Hassan, the head of the health directorate in Hama governorate, was killed 3 hours ago by an aerial bombardment. The medical team there used a cave as a field hospital, but just when he got out of that cave using a van to go back to his home, he was targeted by an airstrike. What do we expect from the international community to help us to stop that problem and to stop the flow of refugees is simply to deal with the roots of that problem. Cessation of hostilities agreement now is not enough, of course. There are violations, but we admit there is a significant reduction in violence. But more important than that, we need more tangible measures on the ground to ensure sustainability of the cessation of hostilities. As long as there are people under siege, as long as there are detainees who die under torture every day, of course this cessation of hostilities will not last for a long period. And you will see people escaping from Syria day after day and trying to come to Europe or to elsewhere.
Thanks, Farouk. It's incredibly powerful. Can I just ask a little bit more about this ceasefire? In March, as you said, we've seen less civilians killed than at any other time during the 5 years of the conflict. So that's obviously a good thing, and the ceasefire is obviously working. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how we can build on that to try and end the conflict in Syria?
Well, that actually helped to give hope back for Syrians. During the past 5 years, Syrians on the ground heard of so many conferences and so many political initiatives, and they felt frustrated after the failure in all of these political initiatives. Why? Because they couldn't see a change on the ground in their daily life. For the last round of negotiations, we had more hope because this is the first time when we see some change on the ground, a reduction in violence, and some convoys from the UN were allowed to enter some besieged areas. Of course, not to all areas, not to assist everybody, but at least that small change gave hope that now it might be different, this round of negotiations. But of course, people expect more. People expect final and absolute opening for humanitarian access for all areas, which does not include only sending some food kits every few months. It includes the livelihood projects. It includes allowing injured people to go out and get treatment. It includes allowing young men and women to go for their jobs to agricultural lands and for the students to go to universities. This is not applicable now. Until now, there are still violations, aerial bombardment and mortar bombardment. But we keep hoping that this will have an end.
And just lastly, I mean, I think it's just really useful to talk about Syria because obviously Syrians form the largest number of people in terms of displaced people around the world, and where you've given such a vivid description of the problems and the kind of the hope that both the White Helmets have given and the ceasefire. I mean, to really stop the refugee crisis, we need to stop war in Syria. Can you just give us your sort of personal reflections on what that political solution could look like, how we actually can end the conflict? Do you have any ideas on what needs to happen?
Well, we are a neutral, impartial humanitarian organization. But of course, as Syrians, we know who is responsible of our suffering. We know who is responsible of this humanitarian crisis. The siege is not done by itself, and the barrel bombs are not falling by themselves. There is a dictator there who has been oppressing the Syrian people for years, and before him was his father, and it was the same ruling party for 50 years who prevented all kinds of freedom of expression, and it did not allow the different segments of the Syrian community to get their legitimate rights peacefully. That was the problem. And when in 2011, when hundreds of thousands of the Syrian people marched in the streets peacefully, there were no armed groups and there were no armed resistance and there were no extremism in Syria. There were purely young men and women marching and calling for democracy and human rights. The action of this dictatorial regime, which does not tolerate any kind of reforms, is responsible of that. There will be no peace in Syria with this regime. There should be a real political transition to hand over power for a legitimate authority elected by the Syrian people.
Thanks, Farouk. I mean, I don't know if everyone realises how brave those comments are. I mean, we heard what in the opening plenary earlier today with Malik in terms of when he made statements about that. So thank you so much for your brave and outstanding work, Farouk.